Dr. Jazz.
The podcast, and you've done like for the Yale oral history, I've read hundreds of interviews. And where does this love or interest of doing this and for the music come from, actually? I mean, of course, you're a musician and you're a collector of music and listener, but still, where does this come from?
Well, it's a history passion that I think comes out partially of being Armenian and having a lot of interest and respect for history and capturing it. I got involved with Yale 11 years ago as a fan of their oral history department. And I went in and I met Vivian Perlis, who was the person that started it in the 60s when American music was not taken very seriously in the classical world. Yeah. It was all about post-Germanic traditions. So Vivian started studying Duke Ellington and interviewing all of his sidemen that were still alive. And she also did a Hindemith oral history. She did a Charles Ives oral history. So she was, the grand dame of oral history in America. And I was a fan of hers. So when I met her and had the pleasure of sitting down and chatting with her, I said, I really like this collection. It's incredible, but it's all full of dead white guys. And I think it doesn't fully represent American music. And so, she said, well, what do you suggest? I said, well, you have to get jazz people. You have to get more women. You have to get, more diversity in this. And she said, who can you get? And I had just been in Stuttgart with the Musical Box. And at the breakfast in the hotel, I saw Carla Bley and Steve Swallow. Okay. And sitting with them was Billy Drummond, who I go back to summer of '89. Billy and I were in Brazil. He was with Horace Silver. I was with Cecil Taylor.
Wow.
And it was both of our first big gigs. So I went over, said hi to Billy. He introduced me to Carla and Steve. Of course, I was a huge fan. And so I said to Vivian, I think I could get you Carla Bley. And she said, go ahead, see what you can do. So I was able to interview Carla. Oh. Went really well. It was my first interview for Yale. And it ended up being one of the top acquisitions of the Yale Library that year. So pretty much from that point on, I could, write my own script there. And I was able to get, just the short list, Andrew Cyril, Benny Colson.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah.
Steve Reich, Phil Woods, Jack DeJohnette, Joe Lovano.
Wayne Shorter, right? Sonny Rollins.
Sonny Rollins.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Pat Martino, Vinnie Colaiuta, Liebman. Goodness, Gary Peacock. Guys who are, not with us anymore and going really in depth. But here's the thing. Oral history interviews are not the same as a discussion or a conversation. So you basically let the person talk and they tell their life story. So what was missing from that was a little bit more kind of give and take for that, because I felt I wasn't supposed to ask a lot of follow-up questions. I guess that was my original kind of instruction, but I found that as I started to ask more questions and show these great artists that I knew their work and that I knew what they were into and was curious about the details, then things started to open up more, and they started to become, I mean, Sonny Rollins and I talked about comic books for the first 20 minutes.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, Wayne too. Wayne Shorter's another guy really into comic books and sci-fi. So I would, you know, I obviously would want them to be aware that this isn't just a press interview, but that led to the podcast because after COVID, when COVID hit that summer, and it was like the lockdown summer, nobody was gigging. People were trying to connect over Zoom. And I thought, if I could just talk about music with musicians that I love and that I have some rapport with, then that would be an outlet for keeping music alive in some way, and also capturing. Everyone wanted to talk about their concepts, you know. So 2 years ago, you know, 2 summers ago is when we started in August. And now we're going to be going, if next August will be 3 years, 77 episodes so far.
Wow.
And trying to mix it up, trying to keep it stylistically diverse, because I'm very interested in jazz, rock, classical, avant-garde, improvisation, anything that I feel is somehow progressing in terms of musical concepts or cultural impact. Or, you know, if you look at musicians like Milford Graves, you know, on one hand, he's an herbalist. He was a guy involved with Latin music growing up in Queens, and then he became interested in free jazz, and, you know, was such a unique figure. And being able to talk to him about what he does, and being able to talk to guys from Gentle Giant.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah.
You know, guys from Genesis, guys from XTC. Those are some of my favorites. And they're open to talking when they realize, oh, I'm talking to a musician, I'm talking to a player, I'm talking to someone who really knows this stuff. And then we get into some stuff. We get, you know, we go deeper. And I want to know what their background is. I want to know what their inspiration is. I want to know what their influences are.
Yeah.
You know, and it's been a joy.
Yeah, it's kind of like me, the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I just basically go through my record collection. And it's so diverse. That's why the interviews include really like fusion, if I use the terms, but it's kind of under jazz, let's say, but, you know, improvised jazz, fusion, except smooth jazz is not included. I don't have that. But, you know, it's really like diverse, and I just love it. It's just like people usually respond, and it's so nice to talk also, not to, you know, I think John Scofield did like trillion of interviews, but I really want to know, you know, people who are a little bit under the radar but should be up there, if you know what I mean. Like in guitar world, like Ben Monder, you know, or Steve Cardenas, or all these guys, and drum world, every world, you know, you guys who are composers and band leaders, and you see you have like 30 records out there or something as a band leader, and it's like, man, you know, I love this stuff, just this investigation of, not sure, would be fun to talk to Jack Jeanette, but, you know, it's like I kind of know already a lot because he's been out there so much, you know. So
right, yeah, I do try to get some of the lesser known figures, also young guys.
Yeah,
it's good to you know, encourage the young scene, and there's a lot of interesting young players and composers.
It's crazy. Yeah.
So anybody that says that, you know, there's no music happening anymore, I don't understand that.
It's just so hard to follow. I mean, like, you know, I teach, and I think every week a student tells me, like, for one new band that's not actually new, it's been there like 10 years already. I'm like, shit, what? Okay, writing it down, you know, and checking it out, and it's just like it's amazing. Yeah. But Greg, I think you're one of the most strangest characters I've encountered in my musical. I don't, in a positive way, because I have you on so many improvised records, and then you're like a prog fusion drummer, and I really want to investigate this a little. How did this happen? And at both parts you're amazing, and then you're a band leader also with your music, which is kind of a mix of everything. And first I want to ask you, what I guess in the late 70s or early 80s, late 70s, what got you excited for jazz especially, and for exploring this free side of music, that in the 90s became so strong in your playing? And
well, it's a bit of a long story, but I came up with mom and dad who had a great record collection. So I grew up listening to Monk and Miles and Basie, Live at the Sands, and so much classical and rock and all of this. So I was sort of primed, but also very aware at an early age. Like I remember hearing Revolver by the Beatles in 1966 when it came out, and I was 3.
wow.
So I remember I've always had a very strong connection to music, but also didn't know that there were limitations or genres or styles or boundaries, because it wasn't something people talked about. Plus, in the 60s and 70s, everything was on the table.
Yeah, it was all, yeah.
The industry was, the culture was about exploration. The culture was about not just experimentation, but also amalgamation of all the different things that people were interested in. You mentioned my stuff, that, that's what I do based upon what I grew up listening to, which was every project should include a lot of variety, show the different aspects of your musicality, your writing, your improvising, your group concept, interaction. So the faster version of the story is that, by the time I was in high school, I was playing in percussion ensembles, I was playing in jazz groups, I was playing in rock bands, mostly cover bands, some originals. I started writing chamber music because I was studying with Jeffrey Kresge at William Patterson, where I now teach. And again, everything was on the table, but what ended up happening to go from prog to free was there's a record by King Crimson called Lark's Tongues and Aspic. And there's a percussionist on that record named Jamie Muir. And he was my gateway, because I said, I have to hear more of this Jamie Muir guy. I can't even tell what he's hitting. I can't even tell it's like, what does his setup look like? I was fascinated with him because I didn't get to see Crimson with him. There was no footage. We didn't have YouTube. I mean, we didn't, but I found in 82, Derek Bailey did a record with Jamie Muir called Dark Drug. And I was in love with that record. And I had been playing in free improv groups in my town with like-minded people. I always included structured improvisation in a lot of my groups, and ways of approaching how we interact, rules, or no rules, or sticking to a concept and keeping it clear. That's big for me. And so when I heard Jamie and Derek together, I became very fascinated by Derek Bailey's playing, because as a guitarist, he was so percussive and so rhythmic.
Yeah.
And a year after that, I was still in college at Rutgers, and I went to see Derek play with John Zorn and George Lewis at this little hole in the wall on the East Side. And I went up to Derek and I said, Mr. Bailey, I'm a big fan of your work. I would love to play with you sometime. And he said to me, how's tomorrow?
Wow.
And I said, that's great. And he said, pick me up, get me an amp, and take me to where we're going to play. It was that simple.
Wow.
I actually ran tape I still have the tapes of the first time Derek and I played. We went on to record 4 discs of material,
sure.
duets, and quartet with Pat Metheny and Paul Wertico called The Sign of Four.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that actually later, but yeah.
Okay. But yeah, Derek was so open, and you could try things, including playing rhythmically, playing with pulse, which had been something that was sort of avoided in a lot of the New York free jazz, if you will, kind of scene. Like, don't play time. But I was always interested in what Paul Motion said in an article I read in high school, where he said, for me, there's always time. There's always some sense of pulse, or there's always some sense of duration. There's always some sense of things moving at a pace, right? And that's when I started thinking about, well, how would you notate these sounds from free improvisation? Because I was studying classical, right? And then how would you improvise something that sounds composed like contemporary classical? And that was where it was sort of the nexus of where I ended up, was not about genre, but almost more about freedom versus structure, themes that could be improvised upon. I mean, I had listened to so much stuff. I mean, all the Eiler stuff, all the Cecil stuff, all of the Ornette stuff. And I realized they were all different, and the approaches were all different. I mean, Ornette's drummers, they swung. Cecil's drummers did not have an interest in regular pulse until Ronald Shannon Jackson came along, and he did. And so that gave me some courage too, to say, well, what if people are playing, this maelstrom of sound, and then you lay down time in the middle of that? And I expanded that concept into everybody is playing time. If you are playing and you have a grid or a pulse in mind, even if they don't have the same pulse as you, their material is now going up against your grid.
Yeah.
So you can get an idea of where they are time-wise. And once I got into that, then I really found my thing, because I was metrically modulating, shifting tempos, speeding up, slowing down in an audible way, so that I just felt like it gave me something more to hang on to in terms of what I was playing. Because totally free, I don't know if that's even possible, but I don't know that I ever really did it, because I always want to play off of something. I always want to play, even if it's just an idea in my head. I kind of tend to limit, and this comes out a lot in my solo percussion music, I limit the piece to 1 or 2 concepts.
Yeah.
And I don't try to do a million things. I don't try to, I want clarity. I want some sense of the listener, knowing a little bit of what's going on, not being completely untethered. Like, you can hear that I'm playing time, but now maybe you can hear that I'm going in a different direction. You can hear that I'm limiting myself to metal textures. Then you can hear that I'm going to legato sounds. So that's been my thing. It's on the Cecil record, in Fluorescence. I did a different setup and approach for every song. Brushes on one piece, mallets on another, bows on another one, laying out, not playing at all, which is one of the options that many people should explore.
That's heavy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And now I'm, really into the concept of space and longer durations and slowing things down. I think that had a lot to do with COVID. I think that had a lot to do with our sense of time changing.
Yeah.
Those 2-3 years ago, to, oh, I don't have anywhere to rush to right now. What am I going to do? So that's sort of what happened. And like everything I do, I got obsessed. So I listened to everybody. playing, and I played with everybody I could, on the New York scene. And then in Europe, through Derek, I got to play with a lot of the European improvisers like Evan Parker.
Yeah, I saw that you connected with, which was quite rare in the beginning, that someone from the States, of course, now we
I'm
have
sorry,
like,
that broke up. Say that again.
yeah, it's like that you made quite a strong connection, with the UK jazz scene, which back then was not so strong yet. Of course, now you have these connections are stronger, and but back then I think there weren't so many people playing US musicians with Evan or with Derek actually, and
that's interesting that you say that, because in '88, when I was before I had the gig with Cecil, we were just hanging out, go to hear music, go to see performances and at the ballet, whatever it was. And it was a big deal because he said to me, "Oh, I'm going to Europe, to Berlin, to play with all these European guys." And it just clicked, like, that's true. Look at his discography. He's only to that moment played with Americans. And of course, Europeans worshipped him as, a father of free jazz. So that was really funny, because here's how I got the Cecil gig. Is he said, "Yeah, and I'm playing with this guitar player. I've never heard of him. Derek Bailey. Do you know who he is?" And I said, "Yeah, I play with him." "Oh." So I said, here's a tape. Let me play this for you. And I played it for him, and he of course, got it right away. He said, "Oh, you guys are changing textures so fast that I've never heard anybody do it that way before." I said, "Well, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at this. It's a different approach. They're influenced by you, but everybody's trying to do their own thing, because that's the marching orders, is do your own thing." And so he went over and he started playing with them. And that's around the time Derek started bringing me over to Europe to play with him. And I was always interested in that, because for instance, I'm very interested, if you've seen my discography or my career at all, I've always been interested in the difference between New York and LA in terms of progressive music or creative music. Very different, but equally fascinating, I think.
Yeah.
The Chicago scene, a lot of guys there too. Derek and I played with Roscoe Mitchell there. Evan and I did some shows with Roscoe as well. And that's a really important concept in my music, is that if there's a will, if there's goodwill, then good music can happen. If you're interested in the other person and you're listening, you should be able to find a musical connection. And that's been, that's my whole approach.
Yeah. How was it like playing with Cecil for you? Remember the first gig? I mean, like...
I do. He called me at 7 a.m, woke me up. Of course, he didn't say, "Hi, this is Cecil." He says, "Can you be in Cambridge to play with us tonight in Boston? Tony Oxley is unavailable." And at the time, I had an office job. I had like a, regular workaday job. And I said, "Yes, of course." Called in sick. And I went up to Boston for like 3 nights of shows with Cecil in trio with William Parker.
Wow. Okay.
And I mean, I had studied with Andrew Cyril. I had studied with Steve McCall. I had, put in time playing along. And this is a really great tip for people, playing along to Cecil's solo records. So Cecil's solo piano records are music minus drums.
Yeah, exactly.
You can treat them like, what is he doing? How is he organizing it? Why did he stop there? Oh, this part's longer. Oh, now there's something very organized and harmonic here. And you start to think like, what would I do? And I would practice. And I also practiced playing along to those Charlie Hayden duet records where it was just Charlie and Keith, or Charlie and Ornette. And so, it was very helpful to me to have to figure out what I want to do by hearing how those guys played. Now, the thing about Cecil was he never told you how to play. Beautiful. You were hired because he trusted you. He knew I was into contemporary classical. He was into contemporary classical. He was into Xenakis and Varese and Stravinsky and Bartók and all those guys, and knew that music, Elliott Carter. And so if I brought a vibraphone, and if I was preparing the drum set with metal or clamps or whatever it was, he didn't bat an eyelash. The only thing he ever said to me was, maybe don't play so loud because the ceiling is very high in here, or just saying something nice like, yeah, you took care of it tonight. But he did not direct. And so you're hired and you have that kind of freedom. And the thing that really blew me away was we were on that tour I mentioned, with Horace Silver Quintet, Cecil Taylor Trio, and John Zorn Naked City, and Max Roach Quartet. And we were touring in Brazil, and I got to hang out with Max. And Max, of course, had already been playing duets with Cecil. So he hears this young kid, I think I was 23 or 24.
Wow.
And I had my approach to how I was going to play Cecil's music. I was not interested in playing like the other Cecil drummers, I have to say. As much as I love them, I heard the possibility of other textures, other treatment of rhythm, other use of space. Whereas a lot of that, drumming with Cecil, they think you got to keep up with him. But there's ways of framing it and laying out and playing quiet and playing backdrop and then coming forward and being confrontational. So all of that with Cecil was on the table. And same thing with Derek. Derek never told me how to play. Yeah. They're there, you're there because they know what you're into and you're going to do it. And if you don't fuck it up, then you're contributing, and that's what they want. I mean, I can't say enough about how democratic jazz has been for me, in a way that rock never was, in a way that I don't know that it could be. But not just jazz, not just free jazz, but a lot of forms of jazz, very democratic. Everybody has a role to play. Everybody has a voice.
The team sport,
Yeah, and it becomes contrapuntal. So even if you're listening to Charlie Parker, Now's the Time, you see that everybody has a voice, maybe less so the bass player at that point. But you see that, the drummer's going to get some. Piano player's going to get some. They're going to be trading. I find that was very inspiring to me to think, oh, this is the same thing. So then when I started getting tired of, I was in Brotzman Trio with Parker for a while.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. How was that like?
Oh, well, same thing. Playing with Brotzman, I just decided I'm going to do something different. So we did that record, Sacred Scrape.
Yeah.
And every piece I do something different. It's not like, here's take 2 of the same thing. Here's take 3 of the same thing. It's like, well, we did that. Now we're going to go somewhere quiet. Well, we did that. Now we're going to go somewhere really fast. Well, we did that. Now we're going to go somewhere really slow. And it goes back to I think it goes back to listening to the Beatles. I think it goes back to listening to Led Zeppelin and just going every track's a different universe.
Yeah, orchestrating the album, actually. Yeah.
Orchestrating an album, orchestrating an evening, orchestrating a performance. Don't use everything on every piece, just stay on snare drum for a little bit. There's plenty to do. so that's, again, that came out a lot of from my solo percussion stuff, because I started performing solo percussion in 85, and I didn't play with Cecil until 89. Derek I played with starting in 83. But that was when it was about, I was really into this idea of variety. Like Prez always said, I try not to be a repeat offender. You know, I like that. It's like, oh, you want to bang people over the head with the same thing, it's like hard enough for them. You're like in the stratosphere. Give people something, that shows, oh, this is what we're doing. I can't say enough how much I do like clarity in improvisation. And if you think about how clean guys like Cecil and Derek were in their execution, you better be clear, because otherwise you're mucking up what they're doing. Because what they're doing is, I was in rehearsals with Cecil where, those fast cluster chromatic runs that he's famous for. He was practicing those 7, 8, 9 times exactly the same, like exact execution. That blew me away, because I heard him practice.
Yeah.
It's not, I don't know if people realize, like Cecil would practice 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day. And, he'd just be getting, I'm going to Boston, I'm going to London to play, and I have a recital, and he'd work out new material. And, so I saw the work that went in. Derek, again, indefatigable practicer. The best horn players, Jimmy Lyons, super, virtuosic alto player. And I was coming in right after Jimmy had died. And I felt that Jimmy was a huge part of Cecil's music, and I felt his absence in the music. So when I was playing with Cecil, I tried to be a little bit more of a foil for him, a little bit more of a instigator, because now there was no horn player in the band. There's no horn player in there for a while after Jimmy dies. But I hope that answers your question. Cecil was great, and being able to do a record with him, and a record where he included 2 of my solo percussion compositions, Entity and for Steve McCall. And that's his only major label record on A&M, and it's a studio recording, whereas most of his records are live. And I've been told a lot. Yeah, and Milford told me, and also Bill Dixon told me that they used it because it had short pieces. They used it to teach kids about Cecil's music. Because you can't ask a kid necessarily to sit through 40
it's more acceptable.
minutes.
Yeah.
But this was 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. And I liked that about that record, because it's kind of unique for him.
Yeah. And it's also you and William connected so amazingly. I think, throughout, you're not like your classical rhythm section. It's really like you said, leaving space and then something like this going like this, or yet you're together in a sense. I love that when I hear you either with, in Williams' bands or with Cecil or with Brodsman. It's like really amazing to hear that.
Well, William and I always had a good connect. I knew how rhythmic he was. I knew what tempos he was in. I knew how he responded to Cecil, so I had to figure out how am I going to respond to William. I don't know if the other strange thing about me might be just how much I overthink this stuff. I try to be free in the moment, but there's just a part of me that's like organizing. And so I'll organize, I don't know if this is strange to say, if it's possible, but I organize what the other guys are doing by what I do. And sort of then they, of course, organize what I'm doing by what they do. And that's the group collaborative process. Your decisions are all contingent upon what you're hearing, because it's a listening game.
Bouncing off, yeah, sure.
That's my other strength, is that I listen. I listen very carefully. I pick up on little things that then can be used in an improvisation that someone else played. A moment where we all come together and something happens, you know. I think I'm the only drummer that ever played rhythmic unison with Cecil, because I figured out where his pulse was. And when he's doing those triplet contrary motion triads on the piano, I played those with him at times because I'd never heard anybody do that.
Yeah.
Let me double what he's doing there. It's would anybody, you know, arrest me if I did that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, not hearing you with William, you know, because I've heard William so many times live with Hamid, let's say, and you know they fall into their thing, and it's kind of, with all respect, the same always with whoever they play, you know. It's whether it's European guys, Brutsman or Mats Gustafsson or Ken Vandermark or whoever it is, it's kind of the same vibe going on. But like with you, he played completely differently. It's which I find quite fascinating, actually. I mean,
I'm very happy to hear that, because that was the goal.
Yeah,
I heard all those situations as well, and I thought, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a time and a place, obviously, when you need to go, you know, full bore, full Monty in there. But I kind of also like scale. So I like that you go from silence, and somewhere in the middle there's a medium, and then somewhere there's the maximum.
Yeah.
And I got that from Stockhausen. When I studied Stockhausen's music as a college student, I read a book about his work. I'm trying to think who, maybe Tim Page wrote it. And it was Stockhausen talking about how there's different kinds of scales. And one of the scale is density.
wow. Yeah.
So the scale of density goes from 0 to X. What if I am improvising over that scale?
Yeah, yeah.
What if the tonic is maximum density, or the tonic is silence? You know, what is home base? I actually do like to give people home base. That might be the difference too. I know that one of the reasons you mentioned those situations being samey is because there's an acceptance of a sort of a tradition that developed, I don't know how, but the tradition that let's say the Eiler spiritual unity is ground zero for that stuff. Yeah. Okay. So say ground zero of a perceived tradition of free jazz is the spiritual unity record. You have a bass player that does not assume the role of bass player unless it's the head, but generally he's a free agent to solo as a second voice to the saxophone. Now, my favorite stuff, of course, is the quartet, where they add Don Cherry, and then you have the Vibrations record. Shout out to Tim Motzer, who just bought that in a bargain bin in Philly. But yeah, he'd never heard that record. But yeah, that quartet, it's not the Ornette quartet with Don Cherry. It's much less. Sonny Murray is, to me, Sonny Murray is a texture. Mm-hmm. For that. He's not really a rhythmic force. He's just sort of a circulation of rhythmic sounds, none of which I particularly ascertain to be a pulse. And so you have Eiler, and you have Peacock, and then you have Don Cherry. If that's the approach, then the drummer has nothing to go with there. So Sonny Murray didn't. The only way Sonny Murray helped me is that I got the Inflorescence gig, the record, because he didn't show up. It was actually originally supposed to be a reunion with Sonny Murray. Very few people know this. And John Snyder said, he's not showing up. We're not waiting. And he's like, well, I have Bendian. So he's like, call Bendian. So that's how I ended up, because that was also a call while I was at my office job. It was like, can you be at the studio at 3 o'clock at RCA? And so I had to, deal with that. But yeah, it's that's telling you there is no discernible pulse.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, whatever it is, I came up with jazz rock. I came up with Indian music. I saw the first Shakti show in Central Park in 76, 75. That was an honor. That was the first time they all played there. I saw Ravi Shankar and Alaraka, thanks to my dad. So I was really interested in rhythm. So it wasn't like when I heard free jazz, I go, oh, finally, the absence of that annoying rhythm. It was sort of like, okay, why do these? But then you got guys like Milford and Andrew, and there's certain guys like that you could tell they were playing time.
Yeah.
Paul Motion especially. He was my guy.
Yeah, I also love Motion, yeah.
And if you listen to Inflorescence, I think you hear a lot of Paul Motion's influence on my playing. Just the way I
playing time, but breaks, yeah. I mean space. I hear that, yeah.
And also rim shots and things that he would do for articulation that I thought were very, very expressive. I learned a lot from Paul, and he was very nice to me. And he congratulated me when I had the Cecil gig.
Oh, wow.
And we talked on the phone, and he got a kick out of me because I would ask him all these, it was the beginning of the podcast in 1981 or something. It's like, hey man, what are you writing, a book? Paul's so funny, He's like, you writing a book? Paul, no, I'm just a big fan. He goes, oh, okay. So I asked him these questions, what's folk song for Rosie? Oh, Rosie was my sister, and then because the Armenian drummer, composer, band leader thing.
Yeah.
Exactly. You gotta know how huge that was for me. Huge. And you could hear it in his music. So that was the other influence, was I was always going to have one piece on an album that was going to reference my Armenian heritage and reference my history of my people, my ancestors. And so even when I had Gregg Bendian project with Smoker, Golia, and Dresser.
Yeah, I love that one, man. That's a beautiful one.
Thank you.
That's a killer.
That was what I called chamber jazz. So, I'm writing for 3 voices and drums, then eventually vibraphone, but that one has the Armenian genocide memorial piece after Çomaklu. And so that, that's been a through line through almost all of my records, is a nod to my Armenian heritage. And I play Dumbek and gone to a lot of Armenian dances growing up. So 7, this is the other thing. People say, how do you play Mahavishnu? I say, well, I grew up listening to Armenian music and Turkish music. It's all in 7 and 5 and 10.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. If it's in 4/4, great. But I mean, I hear da, da, bikata, zekata, yikata. Like I hear and I hear that in a way now more than ever. Even in a total spacious situation, if I can play what I want on the kit, and I've been playing with Tim Motzer recently, wonderful guitar player from Philly, and he's into rhythm too. So even if you're improvising in rhythm, the groupings can be whatever the groupings need to be. And so now I'm so steeped in all these different groups of 2s and 3s and 3s and 2s and all of those things. But it had a lot to do with my grandfather having 78s of the Turkish and Armenian stuff, going to dances, knowing what the steps looked like, because they had to include 3+2. That's heavy, actually. If you can physically feel the groupings, then you're not thinking. So it's muscle memory is very important, as you know. So yeah, that's that group with Smoker, the late great Paul Smoker, Vinnie Golia on reeds, and Mark Dresser on bass. I was writing for that as if one moment it's Ornette, the next moment it's, Elliott Carter.
Yeah, you hear that.
And I could write very expansively for them. Paul, had extended register. Vinny had extended register. Mark had extended register. I wrote violin parts for Dresser.
Yeah, he can play
and
anything.
Just got up off the neck and played them.
Yeah.
He's by the bridge. Yeah. So I've really had a good experience with meeting like-minded musicians who are open to what's the next thing. Yeah. Because once again, as you know, everything's back on the table because the business is what it is. So you might as well just do what you're going to do.
Sure.
Right?
True. Exactly. Yeah. So
you do what you're going to do. I'm working on a prog epic album right now, which it had to happen, I guess.
Wow.
I never did one. But it's all inspired by isolation and loneliness that we experienced during COVID. And it's called The Lighthouse Keeper and Other Tales. And I'm hoping to finish it in the next few months.
Oh, fantastic.
But it's chamber, rock, jazz, multiple woodwinds, female choir, wow. Percussion ensemble. I do 19 overdubs on some of these things. And yeah, so maximalist, I think, in a way. And also just don't edit yourself.
Yeah.
Because now we might as well really give the purest presentation of what we're about. There's no reason not to. I feel an urgency to it.
No, especially after COVID. Yeah, I think these things clarified in each one of us. Definitely.
Yeah, and doing it is its own reward. And doing it and making it personal, which is something I always preach to my students. Make it personal. How did you feel about that? What happened to you in that situation? How does that make you feel? I'm pretty sure it's not exactly the same as anybody else. And then you kind of cultivate, and I love working with young musicians that are excited about music. Mm-hmm. And you want to cultivate what it is that little thing that you're into that nobody else is into. See, I never had that problem. I did the first comic book prog jazz album, Requiem for Jack Kirby, in 2001, when nobody cared about comic books or Marvel or anything for that matter. Now it's $1 billion industry. But you just sort of go with
what you feel.
At that moment, what have I done? What have I not done? That's a big thing for me. And then the other thing was I wanted to, throughout my main thing is doing my own music. People know me for Cecil. People know me for Derek. Some people know me for Todd Rundgren. But then they're not interested in maybe coming over to the other side. But, I like to do my own thing and I like to collaborate with the greats. So, working with Todd is very exciting, very challenging, very demanding what he wants from a drummer. And it's very minimalist. Mm-hmm. So again, it kind of helps to get into your 50s and realize you don't have to do a bunch of shit. You can just be there and make it feel good and just play the music. Because I always also say, you have to play the music that's put in front of you. Sure. So if it's a trumpet, saxophone, acoustic bass, and you got a little kit, you're going to play that music that requires. You're not going to be able to play rock and roll with that, I don't think. But then you're also in a situation where, all I have is a vibraphone.
Yeah, exactly.
What's that musical universe? So that's been something too, is each piece is its own universe. Each project is its own universe. Each grouping of people is its own universe. And, the diversity of people I've played with, Jan Hammer, for instance, that was a whole other experience because he told me that jazz rock is not jazz rock. he told me that jazz was dead, that he was there when it died.
Wow. Okay.
Now, I don't know. I've always been fascinated that he said that, but the idea that he's there going from Elvin to Mahavishnu in 71, right? And Elvin's down with everything that's happening, you know, because he was just so incredible. But Jan apparently at that point went to another place musically and felt jazz had nothing for him, or traditional jazz, let's say, swing. He wouldn't do another, and never did do another jazz record. And so he calls it improvisational rock. So you have to have rock chops, you have to have jazz chops, but it's still within that vocabulary. You have to be real.
Yeah.
You have to play that music. You know, the way you play on, and so that's maybe another through line that goes through my stuff, my career, is that I really try to be authentic in any one of those situations, and be responsible enough to know what the hell you should and shouldn't do.
Yeah. No, I love you as a band leader. You know, I have quite some albums, and you know, it's like Interzone is its own world, and you know, the quartet you mentioned with Vinny and Paul, I love that stuff. It's like hints of Ornette, but then you go somewhere else. And you know, with Nels, I love what Nels does, Nels Cline on your records, you know, because he's such an amazing player, but yet, of course, he had the singers. But, you know, on your records, he's playing completely different, like, and I really love that. And I wanted to ask you, how did you hook up with Nels? And you guys shared quite a long musical relationship.
Yeah. Nels and I did 4 records together, 3 with Interzone, and then our duet, Interstellar Space Revisited, music of John Coltrane. And a very fertile period. I was going to LA a lot. Interzone was really my LA band. It starts with Dresser on bass because the brothers Cline were coming to New York, and we could do it that way. But, you know, Mark went where we went. It goes to Vinny Golia. Shout out to Vinny. He said, "Oh, that's actually weirder. I told this on my podcast with Alex, but when I was playing with Tim Byrne in '83, we were just getting together to jam. He said, you remind me of this drummer I know from LA." And I was like 20. I said, "What?" He goes, "Yeah, this guy, Alex Cline?" I said, "No." He goes, "Yeah, you remind me of Alex Cline, the way dynamic." Okay. So Vinny, years later, 90s, 92, says, "You should hang out with Alex. He's around. He'd love to meet you." So I go to Alex's house, and it's the eternal hang. It's like I left there at like 4 a.m. or whatever it was. We're like standing on the street saying goodbye for 3 hours, you know. So Alex and I had like mind meld, and it was like he had grown up with parents who were teachers. He and Nels had grown up with all the same records I had. He and Nels had grown up with a good education system in Los Angeles that I had in New Jersey, and so many parallels. So it was like, once you guys all have a similar upbringing and have the same record collection,
yeah,
it's just so much to go. You just go. So Alex and I were playing, and Interzone started actually in a different aggregation because Vinny Gully was playing sax in it at one time.
Okay.
Nick Kiergo was the guitarist, and Joel Hamilton, who would later be the bassist, was the first bassist. So he came back, and it was through Alex, I said, you know, I'd really like to have Nels play on this. Do you think he'd be available? And he was. And that was the beginning of an amazing run of stuff, because they were down with whatever. So they didn't love reading my charts because some of them were, you know, 4-pagers or whatever. But they were incredible at melding that. Is it improv? Is it composition? all of the strategies of, oh, we're going to do an improvised intro and then we're going to start Sanctuary. Nothing was ever vetoed or argued about. Is when it's that kind of thing, it's so special. It's just connection. So Nels and I had this thing where, on things like Titled on the first Interzone record, or even like Drive on Myriad, where we're just like blazing. I was doing fuzz vibes at that point, distorting my sound, and I was trying to be against his guitar, another kind of guitar, and we would get blazing in terms of density, and Nels can really get around the neck of the guitar. And at one point, we were in rehearsal in my house in Teaneck at the time, and he said, if we're going to play this way together, we might as well just cover Interstellar Space. And it was really strange because I immediately said, what if we did? Because I love that record. He loved that record. We knew that record was reviled among Coltrane fans. And at that time in the 90s, people couldn't hang without Coltrane. Later, Coltrane, forget it. And the Ken Burns thing had just come out, and all these people had not been included. And we were like, you know what? Our cover project, our repertory project is Interstellar Space, motherfuckers. What are you going to do about that? Lincoln Center. So we really did. We did it very respectfully. We did transcriptions. We studied it. We set up structures. We performed it as a suite. We toured it, and it was recorded in concert.
Yeah.
But that's some of my most balls to the wall drumming.
Yeah,
But I loved Rashid. Rashid was very nice to me. I had the wonderful experience of the record did well as far as those kinds of things go, because we went through the Coltrane estate, and Alice was signed off on Interstellar Space Revisited. So eventually what happened was Bill Milkowski, I think, played it for Rashid as a blindfold test in a magazine. I don't know if you ever saw that.
No, I have to check it out.
And Rashid freaked out. He's like, what is this? I got to get this. I'm going to buy this record. He's like freaking out. And he goes, yeah, these guys really got it. And because obviously we were taking shit for doing guitar and drum Interstellar Space. Again, like we care. I mean, the thing with Nels is he's fearless.
Sure.
So I guess I was equally fearless. And I said, yeah, like, what if we do Interstellar Space? And it wasn't through any sort of ego tripping. It was just like, that music is so cool. You have so much you can do. But look at what Rashid did. What can I do with that? We're going to have the sleigh bells. We love the sleigh bells. Those are going to be in there. It's like Venus is going to be the ballad. There's just so much of a platform there for you to do what you want to do. And of course, Rashid, he was slick, man. Rashid could play. He was just one of my favorite drummers, because like Coltrane, when he said I like Rashid, he's multi-directional. That's true. If Coltrane said it, look for that. How is Rashid multi-directional? And you listen to the different ways he approaches the time and the different ways he approaches to orchestrating the kit. And it's a motherfucker. True. So we love that record, and we're like, you know what? No one's going to do it. We should just do it. And when we did it, the Coltrane estate was into it, and Rashid was into it. And, young audiences, rock audiences were kind of into it too. And for a lot of people, it's people's favorite Nels record, because he doesn't play like that I'm not sure what else, but I don't know everything. In Interzone, when I was writing for Nels, I was writing for Nels. And I think that that's important too. I learned that early when I heard that Ellington wrote for his guys specifically. You write to their strengths, you write to maybe push them a little bit, you write for what their sound is. And, you got Nels, so you got 1,001 sounds. And I would write those into the scores. and I would have specific pedal and specific textural things that I wanted from him. Sometimes it was just verbal, but it was like with those guys, it's like 3 words and then like, yeah, okay, go, that it was literally like that. And then you have twins. Then you have twins in your band. Never had that before. So there's already an ESP in the band. In fact, they told me they have to try not to play the same thing as the other guy.
That's crazy.
That's what they have to try to do. Otherwise, they would just play constantly the same thing all the time. It's like, and they get bored with it. Like, well, we'd find it interesting, but I tapped into it because Alex and Nels together is such a force.
Yeah.
So I had features of just them. Let's hear the 2 of them play together. It's great when you have a band where anybody or everybody can lay out and yeah, that guy's got it. Let us set up there are things in Interzone where we'd set up an 11-16 pattern for Nels to blow over. And then Alex is so good with odd time that everything just flowed and he's like Jack and Tony, but in odd meters and and then Nels was just a chameleon. So I would really write, I always wrote to the guys, like I say, writing for Dresser. I wouldn't be afraid to go off of
when I listen to
I
your
wouldn't be
music.
afraid to go up high. I wouldn't be afraid, I'd know you study them. I think, isn't that the best band leader move, is to know what your guys can and can't do?
Yeah. I mean, give them space. I played with so many guys, like, with Tim Byrne and with Rainey and Tony Malaby and these guys. And sometimes I'm just like, shit, I don't even know if I want to play. It's so good to listening, to a duo of Byrne and Rainey. I was like, shit, well, I won't. Sometimes I just didn't play, and it's like, okay.
Well, you see, but that's the thing where I love that. And then you get into what I call the strategies, which is, okay, I'm out. But when I come back in, what does it mean? It better be cool, because I don't want to screw up what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's very important. That's the listening. It's just a lot of trial and error experience, sometimes knowing. I also tend to, I hear the thing before it happens. I don't know if you know what I mean. I imagine it in my imagination, in my ear, before I execute it, and in milliseconds. And when you're on your game, you know when to lay out, and you know when to come in, and you know how to come in.
Yeah.
Because you see, when Cecil would set something up, you got to decide when am I in. He's not going to tell you. He's not going to cue you.
Now
you better know when to come in, and you don't come in a bad spot, because I heard people do that on Cecil gigs.
Oh man, yeah.
I'm like, no, it's not time. Like you become somewhat, objective. If you can be a little bit objective with a lot of freedom, I think that's very useful in music. How many times is too many? How long is too long?
Yeah.
And I've been into this thing now where I do what I call event transformation. So what I'll do is I'll stick with an idea, and it just changes gradually over, several minutes. And that's not something you hear a lot of in improvised music. It almost comes more from process music or contemporary classical stuff, where, this piece, again, Stockhausen, this piece is about changing this sonic entity over time into something else. I brought that in. There are things that I think that I brought in to the so-called free jazz scene that I don't think were there before, that people weren't particularly interested in. But I saw Don Moyer with a shit ton of gear and trying to change stuff up. I saw all the guys with the racks and everything. I grew up in the 70s. I got to see those, I got to experience those things firsthand, the public theater, soundscape, all the I mean, Vanguard, all the clubs that were open. We went to everything. So it's very inspiring. The early 80s were incredibly vital time in New York.
Yeah. Right.
And I was playing with Zorn, I was playing with Tom Cora, I was playing with Ned Rothenberg, Christian Marclay, before I got to play with the Black Jazz guys. That was an unusual move because I was essentially coming from the downtown scene.
Yeah.
And going into, Cecil was in Brooklyn, so I don't know if that's the Brooklyn scene, but I'm going into the other world, the Cecil world. But I was bringing stuff that I had done with Zorn and those guys into his world, and he was like, cool.
Yeah.
I don't know how often that happened, but that was something I'm very happy that I was able to do because it was natural.
Yeah, definitely.
It was organic to me. It was like, well, you guys said there were no boundaries. I'm going to go over here.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, that's beautiful, actually. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you already before, speaking of no boundaries. I think the first record I heard you was that Pat Metheny, Derek Bailey, Paul Vertigo. Of course, I was starting with jazz and collecting everything by Pat Metheny, and then I stumbled upon this record, and I was like, "What?" And
you weren't the only one.
Yeah, and now I love it. Of course, back then I was like, Jesus. Now my favorite record by Pat Metheny is Song X, let's say, with Ornette, of course, and everything else that I listen now, I put on the other day Still Life Talking, which as a teenager I was like, man, this is the best record ever. Now it sounded like it's good, but kind of like, But how did that album come together?
Isn't that the beauty?
Oh, that's
amazing. But this is the thing of you wanted me to talk about Metheny, and I will tell you this.
It's just Metheny and Derek, how they joined. That's I'm curious. That's for me
Well, let me tell you a little bit about what I learned about Pat that made this possible was I knew about Zero Tolerance. I knew, and I saw Song X. So I knew Pat had that side. I knew Pat was not safe. I knew Pat had popular music. I knew that Pat did not particularly have a problem with stepping outside of the Pat Metheny group and doing other things. And some of them were weird and some of them were free. So I knew that. But then I became friends with Paul Wertico. He came to hear me with Roscoe because Paul was in Chicago. And we hit it off and we did a duet record called Bang, which is on Spotify if anybody's interested in hearing it. And that, again, was the same idea. Like each piece is a different universe of textures and rhythms and sound. And so Paul and I were hanging out, and I was going to Pat Metheny group gigs regularly. And that's when I started to get to know Lyle a little bit and start to talk to Pat. And Pat said, so what are you up to? I said, well, I'm playing with Derek Bailey. I have a new record with him called Banter. And he said, yeah, you know Derek Bailey? I go, you play with Derek Bailey? He said, yeah. He goes, oh, man, I would love to have dinner with him. I said, well, you could. I can set that up. By the way, I'm a little surprised that you're into Derek Bailey. And he goes, well, at a certain time in my life, when I was serious about playing the guitar, I made it my business to hear every guitar player that I could possibly hear. And that blew my mind.
Wow.
Because that's kind of what we all do. We're like, I want to hear all the different drummers. I want to hear all the different composers. I want to know, like, what am I up against? Like, what's the level? What's happening? What's already been done?
Yeah.
See, that's a big thing for me. Like, what's already been done? I don't think I should do that. So I've tried, I think successfully, not to do what other people have done, for better or worse. But yeah, so Metheny flipped out, and then I changed it. I said, what about you and me, Paul and Derek. And he goes, let's do it. It's, again, one of those like, when it's going to happen thing. So it was destined. It was immediate. He cleared parts of his schedule for it.
Wow.
Very busy. He's playing at that time. He was playing with the Tales of the Hudson, Brecker thing, and Liebman's thing. I mean, he's doing his thing and collaborating, maxing out. And I realized that, okay, he has an improvising vocabulary, and putting that with Derek could really work. So I ended up being the producer of it, Sign of Four on Knitting Factory Records. You can find it. And Pat was as extreme as you would think he would be. I mean, you know, Sam, because you heard the record, but it's just, I can tell you the live gigs were rough because he's the loudest guitar player I've ever played with. I mean, ear-piercingly loud. And he played in quad. So he had two towers in front of him and two towers behind him. And those two towers in front of him were about 7 feet away from me. So I was playing on Study in Scarlet, the first 78-minute blowout thing, which was literally the first thing we played together at the Knitting Factory Live. When they stop in the middle, which is, or it's probably not even the middle, at some point the guitars actually stop and it's just me and Wertico. That moment, I'm playing as hard as I've ever hit in my life. And I sounded to myself quiet.
Wow.
That's how much the shift, had occurred. I'm hitting as loud as possible. They stop. And now I sound like I'm just playing regular, just hitting hard, not playing that hard. That was kind of a situation. So my favorite disc is the second disc, which is the studio disc where I got them to play acoustic together. Pat can have the fretless guitars, so we're trying at that point. I had the tuned percussion brought in for that. It was much more chamber. And nobody ever spoke about anything. I guess that's also worth saying. There was no discussion of the music at any time. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing. I'm just saying, for the record, it wasn't the kind of thing where somebody said, let's try this sort of thing. People would pick out.
Sorry, how did Derek react to Pat? I mean, did he know Pat? And
yes, but he didn't give it up like, oh, wow, Pat Metheny cares about me.
He's Derek Bailey, sure.
Yeah. So he's like, yeah, okay, cool. Let's, and also, but Derek was always very open to collaboration. He had worked with really unusual range of people, right? So it's not going to freak him out at all. He does the record with Tony. So, didn't you do a record with Jamaluddin also?
Maybe.
I think he did.
Maybe, yeah. I know that in one of the companies that he did, he invited Buckethead. You know Buckethead?
Buckethead, sure.
And it was like who else was it? Was like the strangest lineups of them all, like Buckethead, Derek Bailey's, and some guys. You were like, what?
His company events were such a treasure.
Yeah. Because
each one was different, and he had really unusual combinations. And a lot of times I played with people that did not speak English. So it was, again, that whole thing of like, well, all you have is the sounds. You don't have language right now. You don't have words. And so what are we doing? I played with guys from Tasmania. I played with people from Iceland.
Wow.
I played with all these different people because that's what the game plan was. And so Metheny wanted to play with Derek, probably knew what he was going to do. And then Derek didn't have any preconception, brought an electric, brought an acoustic. He didn't, he played through a twin, I guess. But Pat was so loud that Derek live kind of got buried. So a lot of the mixing process of that record was trying to get, because there was so much leakage, trying to get the volumes right. And then here's the thing. I wanted it to be one disc. Pat wanted it to be 3 discs pretty early on, because he and I were the post-production. And Nick Prout, the engineer. At that point, I'm editing for high points, taking out stuff maybe that's not happening, naming the pieces, telling Pat, what I think would work. And was very agreeable, but he wanted 3 discs. And so since he gave me everything else I wanted to do on every level, I'm like, okay, I have to understand. Pat Metheny is letting me do whatever the fuck I want, like everybody else who did, just like Cecil. If he wants this to be 3 discs and I'm producing it, I can say no, or I can say, okay, let me get into his mindset and think, why does this have to expand to 3? Why is this 3? I think it's a mixed bag. Ultimately, the Sign of 4, I'm very proud of it. It's certainly one of the most controversial records of anybody's career.
Oh man, absolutely.
Pat's fans were very unhappy, but it's a noisy record. It's the spirit of it is true to the spirit of collaboration. I just think we needed more time, because what it was a few live shows and a few days in the studio.
Yeah.
And that was going to be it. I wanted the best of both. But I think the second and third discs, and him wanting the first disc to be the loud, crazy thing, I think a lot of people would have appreciated it more if it could start with the second disc. Yeah. So I always tell people, please start with the second disc. And if you want, do the red disc last. Because it's so true.
Makes sense.
What you lead with, and he wanted to lead with that aggression. And I get that, but I don't think that I think it's too extreme. And if I'm saying it's too extreme, I think I have sort of I try to be objective. Yeah. I'm like, look, that could be the last disc of wall-to-wall noise screeching for 79 minutes, but don't lose people in the first 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think he just wanted probably an extreme to what he was doing with the rest, just to, to be like, okay, fuck you in a sense. I can do this as well. And maybe
it is in there.
I guess,
No, you make a good guess.
But you created one of a kind thing, because one would never think Derek Bailey and Pat Metheny would play on the same album, so, and we have it now. So it's quite incredible to hear, actually. So it's kind of this lineage in the end still connects. It's not like one line and it's like, okay, we can even do that. So that's a nice thing. I think that's
see, I like that. I like the crossbreeding.
Yeah,
I believe in that, because then you're going somewhere it's somewhere fresh, because it has to.
Yeah.
It's just the most unlikely thing that could ever work. Like, should we do interstellar space? Oh, let's try. Let's not talk ourselves out of it before we try, sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? Because if you said Derek Bailey and Pat Metheny, God, what? That's a joke, right? Like, no, it's gonna surprise you.
Yeah. Yeah, everyone should check out that one. It's really, it's quite, I mean, Derek could play, when he plays standards, even you hear him, obviously he was a monster musician.
Well, my favorite is the duet record we did called Banter, and that's on YouTube. And Banter is the high point of my work with Derek. I was able to do everything I want to do, including hand drumming on that record, and I think no one had ever really done hand drumming with Derek.
With Derek, no, yeah,
no. And it's a perfect thing too, because of the way he plays and the way that he's got chunky chords. You'd think, well, you don't need a lot of what if you had no sustained sounds? If your only sustained sounds were rubbing and little finger rolls, you could only do the certain things when you have just dumbek and 2 bongos, which I think is all I use. But again, no one had ever done that, so I thought this could be interesting. And Derek and I had a rhythmic rapport at that point, where I knew I could instigate some shit with him. If I just was playing whatever I was playing, dick dock duk doom, whatever it was, he's going to hear that. That went well. I played both vibraphone and both cymbals on that record. He did feedback against it. It's yeah, I mean, that to me, it's like Derek's listening, and his thing was he doesn't listen. So I also got that out of him. He was so into what I was doing. And I know I'll say this just because I've never said it in public, but George Lewis, the great trombone player and electronics genius, when I interviewed him for Yale Oral History at his office in Columbia, he said, "Oh man, Derek loved you." I said, "What? Derek loved you, man. You were Derek's favorite American percussionist." Now, Derek was not a warm, fuzzy guy. So it's not like he ever once said to me, well, he did once compliment me on this big company event we did at London. And he said, yeah, you changed it up. That was your game plan. He noticed, you know what I mean? He said, you got through the week by changing it up. So, you know, that was a strategy that he appreciated. So that's what I did when we played together. And then he responded to, you know, see, so it's sort of like these concepts are not unspoken, but they're concepts that everyone involved is aware of.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing, right? So how do you capture that? I mean, we're talking about it now, but do people ever talk about how they improvise and why they improvise and what the other person means to them in the equation?
That would be an interesting talk,
You
actually,
know, it's such
among
a ego-driven
musicians.
thing.
You know, when we play with each other, we never talk about that. Could be an interesting one after a gig over a beer, you know, with the guys. You just played an improvising gig. Like, okay, let's talk about that.
I believe in it.
Yeah,
You know, I was in bands where you listen to the recordings and critique yourself. I have over 12,000 pieces of media from my career because I wanted everything that I could analyze when I needed to, not just to document it, but I needed to know when I thought I was doing XYZ, did it actually come across? You have to be somewhat objective, you know, to get the quality. You can't think everything you do is gold.
Sure.
You had a good night. You had a bad night. You thought you had a bad night. You actually had a good night. I mean, you don't even know until, because they say the tape don't lie. But yeah, so I think listening is super important and maybe the most important part of music.
Yeah, definitely.
Some people, I think Miles or somebody said that it's about the space between the notes, but I think it's also about listening and hearing in a way that should be heightened.
Yeah, hearing is
be very ultra hyper vigilant, being aware of every little thing that's going on.
Yeah, listening, that's the advice for students, which is sometimes neglected. You know, I sometimes lead workshops and, you know, you tell students to play a standard and they go into this automatic mode, and it's just like, wait a second, you know, the drummer just goes, it's like, wait, you're not even listening to the bass player. He's not playing doon doon doon. He's leaving space. What are you doing? You know. So what you said, yeah, listening. Yeah. Cool. Greg, you know, thanks for taking the time today, and appreciate it. Any last thoughts?
It's really been fun to get into it. And yeah, check out my channel, The Podcast with Gregg Bendian, on YouTube and all streaming platforms, Spotify, and my website where I'm doing Zoom instruction now in composition and production, drums, rhythm, all sorts of conceptual music, bendianmusic.com. And that's sort of the clearinghouse for all my stuff. My oral history work is there, my videos, my recordings, my discography, my gear, everything is there.
Cool.
Sir, thanks so much, Samo. Really pleasure.
Thanks so much to you too. And hope to see you soon.
Okay, man.
Cool. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.